Mayhem makers, I'm Mindy with Quilting Mayhem, and today I'm going to show you two different ways to bind a quilt. One of them will be using the Bernina number 10D foot, and one will be using the Bernina number 71 foot. They're going to be two different methods, but the same basic concept. So I'm going to show you just some basics, and then we'll get to showing you how it looks on the machine. Okay, so I'm going to show you some basic tools and techniques that I use to make the binding process go easy. One of the things I like to do is have painter's tape actually on the bed of my machine. And I take a piece, and what I do is I'm going to create a line that's going to line up from my needle to where the needle dead center shows on the bed of my machine. What's really nice with this Bernina machine is there's actually a mark on the tray. Other things that I'm going to be using are my rotary cutter, my handy little 3.5 by 6.5 creative grid ruler. This is one of my favorites to have next to my machine for doing all just my small trimming. It's just easy to have and it doesn't get in my way. And then I also use my handy little snips. When it comes to doing binding, some of the basics is I use 2.5-inch strips. Now a lot of times people talk about bias binding. I only do bias binding if I'm doing one with curves. Most of my quilts aren't curvy, so I just do straight cuts. Bias binding we'll tackle in a whole different tutorial. So today, just straight up 2.5-inch strips. I like my binding to be a little wider. You can go down to 2.25, maybe even 2. I call that personal preference. Start with 2.5 till you get comfortable with binding quilts, then you can play around with size of strips. The reason for the tape is that it's going to help me make my joins, so that I need one long piece of binding to go on my quilt. So I need to make sure that I can put my two strips together. So that tape's gonna help me do that. So I'm gonna show you how to line up the tape on the machine, and then I'm gonna show you how to do the diagonal join seam for these two strips of fabric. So as you can see, I have the blue painter's tape lined up dead center with that needle down the center of the bed of my machine. This way I can make sure as I'm sewing my diagonal, everything's going to line up. On my machine, I have my 97D foot, which is my 1/4-inch foot, which is going to help me make sure that all my seams are accurate. The beauty of doing these bindings is that when I put my two pieces right sides together and put it on the bed, it does not matter how they are lined up. They do not have to be a perfect 90 degrees. It sounds odd, but trust me, I can make it super wonky and it's going to line up. So what I do is I make sure where the top two meet and make sure they're right sides together is up to where the needle is going to be, and then make sure where the bottom two pieces meet and make this little divot line up with my tape. And then all I'm going to do as I sew is make sure that this bottom follows the painter's tape. Another thing to note is I do like using this single hole stitch plate. It makes sure that I don't have fabric sucking down into the machine where I don't want it. So this makes sure that I just have a small space for that stitch to go. So let's see how this diagonal stitches out. So I'm going to go a couple stitches and then I'm lining up that edge and we're just going to follow it along to the end. And then we have a handy dandy little thread cutter. And then I take it to my mat and I'm gonna line up my ruler along the edge of my seam and cut my 1/4-inch marking. And then my strip will be one straight strip. What I then do is fold it in half once I trim and iron it. It will then be ready to put onto the quilt. So I'm gonna go cut and press, and then we'll come back and show you how to put it on the quilt. Now we're gonna go and put our binding onto our quilt. Note that I have cut a 45-degree angle on my binding, folded it over a 1/4-inch before ironing it with the wrong sides together in half. I like to do mine where I just tuck it in the end instead of actually merging the two tails when they come together. So this is how I start off my quilts in the more traditional method. So I'm going to lay it down, grab my Wonder Clip that I always have on hand, and I start actually sewing further down. I don't start at the very top, I start below that diagonal. So I have my 1/4 inch foot on, and then I'm just gonna sew a 1/4 inch seam and put the binding on the edge. So I have my 2 raw edges together, right sides together, and I'm going to sew. When I get to the corner, I do like to stop 1/4 inch from the edge, and then I'm actually going to pivot, line the corner of that quilt up with my tape, and I'm gonna sew that 45 degrees right off the edge. This is what's gonna help make it easier to fold the mitered corner on the edge of the quilt. So I have a diagonal there, and I use that to fold my binding out and then back towards myself. And I try to make sure everything looks nice and pretty, line my raw edges up again, and then I'm gonna go straight back to the machine, and I'm gonna start a 1/4 inch down. So don't start at the very edge, start at a 1/4 inch so that your miter actually will fold over easily on the back side. And then I'm gonna start sewing again. And I just keep repeating this process of sewing the binding onto the quilt, doing those mitered corners at each end until I get to the very end. All right, so now that we've come all the way around, what I do is I also cut another diagonal, and then I just tuck it inside, lay everything flat. I can snip off this dog ear if it bugs you, or I just trim it afterwards. But I make sure it's all nice tucked in, everything's laying flat, and then I just finish sewing the binding onto the quilt. Now we're going to wrap our binding over and stitch it down. So I'm going to switch over to my 9mm stitch plate, and I'm putting on the 1D foot and engaging the dual feed system that is in this machine. Make sure that you tell your machine that you have switched over to your 9mm stitch plate and your 10D foot, or it will not let you do things like decorative stitches or zigzags. As you will see, I have wrapped my binding around and just used Wonder Clips to hold it down. I do clip the corners on the inside of the before I wrap my binding around. I just clip that edge, reduce the bulk, fold the corner, fold it on top itself so I have my mitered corner, and I clip both sides of the corner so that miter stays nice and pretty when I get to it. One of the benefits of the 10D foot is that it has a guide in the middle. So that guide is going to follow along your seam between your quilt and your binding. You can do a straight stitch in the ditch, or you can do fun decorative stitches or even zigzags to stitch your binding down. I picked this fun little design number 712, which is hearts, and it will do a cute little decorative heart down the binding, and so it does kind of over the top and over the bottom. And the dual feed helps keep the quilt and the binding all together as you go, and that guide is just following your binding piece down. And that's how you can do quilt binding with the 10D foot. So my preferred method of doing machine binding is actually using the 71 foot. The big difference is going to be that the binding is actually going to be sewn onto the back of the quilt and then stitched down on the top. So I start the same. I have my 45 degree folded over, and I just clip it on, and then I go sew 1/4 inch all the way around, not starting at the top of the binding. So I'm going to make sure I'm down below that Wonder Clip, and I'm going to start sewing my 1/4 inch seam and sew my binding on. And then I'm going to put the 71 foot on, and I'll show you why I like it so much. So with the 71 foot, I have my binding sewn to the back of the quilt. I'm going to wrap it around to the front. A lot of times I will go and iron this backside so it's nice and flat before I do the wrap. Then with the 71 foot, I just make sure that I go and thread that binding into the curve of the foot, and I put my foot down, and I can just kind of thread it back and forth till it's nice and doesn't have too much of a curve in the edge. I do move my stitch. I do move my needle over 2 positions to the left. And then I just do a straight stitch down and it'll cut. And I just do a straight stitch down and it'll get right on the edge of the binding. And the curve of the foot in the front will just keep making sure the binding is folding over. And that's how easy it is with the 71 foot. So I hope this helps you in doing your machine binding and not be stressed out. Hopefully you can use either the 10D or the 71 to get those quilts finished and off your table. Thanks for watching. Happy stitching.